February 10, 1944, 40 yards from the surgical tent at the 56th Evacuation Hospital, Anzio Beachhead, and the 24-year-old nurse from Massachusetts watched the yellowish liquid spread across the mud. She had maybe 12 seconds before the next round landed. Around her, 42 wounded soldiers lay on stretchers in the pre-op holding area. Most were stabilized enough for surgery, plasma lines already running into their arms, fresh bandages over shrapnel wounds that would have killed them an hour earlier. The surgical teams inside the tent were working on the worst cases, chest cavities opened, organs exposed. No time to move anyone before the German batteries found their range. The second shell landed closer, 30 yards. The concussion wave knocked Rourke to her knees. Mud splattered across her uniform and face. She could hear the peculiar whistle of incoming rounds, the sound that meant you had 3 seconds to decide whether to run or stay. Every instinct screamed. Her training said, stay. She grabbed another plasma bottle from the supply crate and crawled toward the nearest patient, a private from Ohio with an abdominal wound who'd already received 2 units. His eyes were wide, tracking the shell bursts, but he couldn't move. The plasma line kept him anchored to this patch of ground that was rapidly becoming the most dangerous square footage on the Anzio beachhead. 3 more nurses were working the holding area. First Lieutenant Mary Roberts from Arkansas, the shift supervisor, was adjusting plasma flow rates on 5 patients simultaneously, moving between stretchers with mechanical efficiency. Second Lieutenant Elaine Rowe from New York crouched over a soldier whose transfusion line had been torn loose by shrapnel from the first impact. Second Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth from Pennsylvania was checking vital signs on the far row of stretchers, her hands steady despite the incoming fire. None of them ran. The mathematics were brutally simple. 42 patients. Most could not move without assistance. Some were unconscious. Others were too weak from blood loss to stand. The nearest bunker sat 200 yards away across open ground. Moving 42 stretcher cases would require at least 20 minutes with a full evacuation team. They had maybe 5 minutes before the German artillery battery walked their rounds directly through the hospital compound. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The shells kept falling in a pattern that revealed the enemy's intent. This wasn't random harassing fire. Someone on the German-held high ground overlooking the beachhead had spotted the Red Cross markings and was deliberately targeting the hospital. International law prohibited such attacks. The Germans had been ignoring that law at Anzio since the January 22nd landings 6 weeks earlier. The 56th Evacuation Hospital had arrived at Anzio on February 7, 1944, 3 days before the shelling incident. The unit had been ordered forward from Naples to help manage the casualty load from what was supposed to be a quick breakout from the beachhead. Instead, the Anzio operation had devolved into a static bloodbath that resembled World War I trench warfare more than modern mobile combat. The beachhead itself was a geographic nightmare for the defenders. Allied forces controlled a roughly 15-mile-wide pocket of Italian coastline, but German forces held the surrounding high ground, including the Alban Hills that overlooked every square inch of Allied-held territory. German artillery observers could see everything, every supply dump, every headquarters, every hospital tent with its Red Cross markings painted on white canvas. The strategic situation at Anzio in February 1944 represented one of the war's most significant Allied miscalculations. Operation Shingle had launched on January 22 with 36,000 troops landing behind German lines, hoping to outflank the winter line defences that had stalled the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. The plan called for a rapid breakout inland to cut Highway 6, the main supply route for German forces defending against the main Allied army to the south. Instead, the Allied commander, Major General John Lucas, had consolidated the beachhead rather than pushing inland. By the time he ordered an advance, German reinforcements had arrived in overwhelming numbers. The window for easy breakout had closed. By early February, approximately 100,000 Allied troops were pinned inside the beachhead, facing 125,000 German troops in prepared defensive positions. The casualty statistics from those first weeks told a grim story. Between the initial landings and the end of February, Allied forces at Anzio would suffer approximately 7,000 killed, 36,000 wounded, and 44,000 sick or injured from various causes. The medical evacuation system was overwhelmed from day one. The 56th Evacuation Hospital was a mobile unit designed to operate close to the front lines, providing immediate surgical care before evacuating patients to base hospitals farther to the rear. In normal operations, an evacuation hospital was set up several miles behind the front where artillery couldn't reach. At Anzio, there was no rear area, everything was in artillery range. The hospital compound consisted of large canvas tents arranged in a specific layout, receiving tents where ambulances unloaded casualties, triage areas where medical officers sorted patients by severity, pre-operative holding areas where nurses prepared patients for surgery, surgical tents equipped with operating tables, lights, and instrument sets, post-operative recovery wards, supply tents, staff quarters. The entire facility could theoretically be packed and moved within 12 hours if necessary. But moving under fire was another matter entirely. The tents offered zero protection against shell fragments. The operating rooms contained patients whose chest cavities were literally opened on the table. Moving them meant death. So the hospital stayed put and hoped the Red Cross markings would provide protection. They didn't. German artillery had been hitting medical facilities at Anzio since late January. Sometimes the strikes seemed random, shells landing on hospitals because they happened to be near legitimate military targets. Other times, the targeting appeared deliberate. Medical personnel reported seeing German observation aircraft circling hospital areas shortly before shelling began. On February 10th, the 56th Evacuation Hospital had been operating at full capacity for 72 hours straight. The Allied offensive that started on January 30th had generated massive casualties. Surgical teams were working 18-hour shifts. Nurses were managing patient loads that exceeded peacetime hospital ratios by factors of 5 or 6. The plasma supply was holding up, but just barely. Plasma had become the cornerstone of shock treatment by 1944. The lessons learned in North Africa and Sicily had been fully integrated into medical doctrine. Every evacuation hospital maintained substantial plasma stockpiles. Every nurse received training in plasma administration techniques. The survival rates for severe hemorrhage cases had improved dramatically compared to earlier campaigns, but plasma couldn't protect against high explosive shells. When the shelling started at approximately 1400 hours on February 10th, Mary Roberts had been supervising the pre-operative holding area where 42 patients waited for surgery. Most had already received initial plasma transfusions at battalion aid stations closer to the front lines. The nurses were administering additional plasma to maintain blood pressure, while the surgical teams worked through the backlog. The first shell landed 40 yards away, close enough that fragments peppered the tent canvas but didn't penetrate completely. Roberts made an instant assessment. The surgical tents couldn't be evacuated without killing the patients on the operating tables. The post-op recovery ward held patients too weak to move. The pre-op area held patients who were stable enough to survive brief transport, but moving them would require pulling their plasma lines and interrupting transfusions that were keeping them alive. She ordered the nurses to stay put and continue treatment. Keep the plasma running, keep the patients stabilized. Hope the shelling stopped before a direct hit collapsed the tents. The second shell landed 30 yards away, closer. The German gunners were walking their fire toward the hospital, adjusting aim with each round. Basic artillery procedure. Fire a ranging shot, observe the impact, correct, and fire again until you hit the target. Rita Rourke was crawling between stretchers now, checking plasma lines that had been disturbed by the concussions. One bottle had been knocked over, the tubing kinked. She straightened the line and adjusted the flow rate. The patient, barely conscious, didn't seem to notice the shells. Shock and morphine had insulated him from the terror. Elaine Rowe was working on a soldier whose plasma line had actually been severed by a shell fragment. A piece of hot metal the size of a fingernail had sliced through the rubber tubing, and plasma was pouring onto the ground. Rowe had maybe 90 seconds to get a new line established before the patient's blood pressure dropped below survivable levels. She pulled a fresh setup from her bag, found a vein in the other arm, and pushed the needle home. The plasma started flowing again. The patient's pulse steadied. Ellen Ainsworth was moving through the far row of stretchers, the area closest to where the roboted shells were landing. Several patients had been hit by fragments from the first two impacts. Minor wounds, mostly, facial lacerations from flying mud and debris, but wounds nonetheless that required immediate attention. She was applying pressure bandages while simultaneously monitoring plasma flow rates on 3 other patients. The third shell landed 25 yards away. The pattern was clear now. The next round would land directly in the holding area. The 4 nurses had maybe 15 seconds. Roberts made eye contact with each of her team. Nobody moved toward the bunker. They kept working. The 4th shell landed 20 yards away, just outside the perimeter of the stretcher layout. The concussion was strong enough to knock over several plasma stands. Bottles shattered, tubing whipped loose. 2 patients started hemorrhaging from wounds that reopened under the shockwave's pressure. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to compress the air itself. And still the nurses stayed. Rourke was reconnecting plasma lines to patients whose transfusions had been interrupted. Rowe was applying direct pressure to a reopened abdominal wound, her hands literally inside the bandages, holding torn tissue together while she shouted for a surgical team. Ainsworth was checking airways on patients who'd aspirated mud and blood when the concussion threw them against their stretchers. Roberts was orchestrating all of it, directing her team with hand signals because verbal commands couldn't be heard over the shell bursts. She pointed Rourke toward 3 patients whose vital signs were dropping. She gestured to Rowe to move 2 stretchers closer together, so one nurse could monitor both simultaneously. She waved Ainsworth back from the impact zone as another shell screamed in. The 5th shell landed 15 yards away. Fragment impacts sounded like hail on the tent canvas. Several patients were hit again, minor wounds but accumulating damage. 1 plasma bottle took a direct hit from a fragment and exploded, showering everyone nearby with broken glass and sticky fluid. The patient connected to that bottle started fading immediately, blood pressure dropping as the volume replacement stopped. Rourke grabbed another bottle from the supply crate and had a new line running within 45 seconds, world record time under any circumstances, impossible under artillery fire. But she'd done it because the alternative was watching the patient die. The shelling lasted 30 minutes total. 17 shells landed in or near the hospital compound. The German battery finally shifted fire to another target, possibly running low on ammunition or responding to orders from higher command. When the last shell fell and the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural. Mary Roberts stood up slowly, checking her surroundings. The pre-operative holding area looked like a disaster zone. Mud everywhere, shattered equipment, torn canvas, shell fragments embedded in supply crates. But 42 patients were still alive. Every single plasma line was running. Not one soldier had been lost to shock or hemorrhage during the barrage. The surgical teams inside the operating tents had continued working throughout the shelling. They'd had no choice. The patients on their tables would have died if the surgery stopped. So the surgeons had kept cutting while shells landed yards away, trusting that probability would spare them for a few more minutes. In the recovery ward, nurses had thrown their own bodies over post-operative patients to shield them from fragments. Several nurses were wounded, none seriously, but they'd absorbed impacts meant for soldiers too weak to protect themselves. The official casualty report from the February 10th shelling listed 6 killed and 18 wounded across the entire hospital compound. Given the intensity and duration of the bombardment, given the lack of hardened cover, given the density of personnel in the target area, those numbers were remarkably low. The pre-operative holding area where the 4 nurses had refused to evacuate reported 0 deaths and only minor fragment wounds among the 42 patients. Within an hour, the surgical teams had cleared enough of the backlog that patients from the holding area could be moved into operating rooms. The nurses who'd just survived 30 minutes of artillery fire went right back to preparing patients for surgery. There was no time for trauma processing or stress relief. The casualties kept arriving from the front lines. The story of what happened in that pre-operative holding area spread through the beachhead within days. Medical personnel from other units heard about the 4 nurses who'd stayed with their patients under direct artillery fire. The story reached headquarters. On February 24, 1944, just 2 weeks after the incident, First Lieutenant Mary Roberts and Second Lieutenants Elaine Rowe, Rita Rourke, and Ellen Ainsworth were each awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation was unusual in several respects. First, it marked the first time in United States Army history that women received the Silver Star, the nation's 3rd highest military decoration for valor. Second, the award came remarkably quickly by military bureaucratic standards. Most valor awards required months of investigation and verification. This one was approved and presented within 14 days. Third, the citation specifically mentioned that the nurses had remained with critically wounded patients during intensive enemy artillery fire, refusing to take cover despite direct orders to evacuate to bomb shelters. That last detail was significant. The nurses hadn't just been brave, they'd been insubordinate. Someone in the chain of command had ordered evacuation to the bunkers, and the nurses had ignored that order, prioritizing patient care over personal safety and military discipline. The Army chose to reward rather than punish that insubordination because the results justified the decision. 42 patients survived who might have died if their plasma transfusions had been interrupted. The mathematics of battlefield medicine sometimes required breaking rules when following them meant unnecessary death. The Anzio beachhead would remain under siege until late May 1944, when Allied forces finally broke out and linked up with the main army advancing from the south. During those 4 months, medical units at Anzio treated approximately 25,000 battle casualties under conditions that tested every assumption about combat medicine. The evacuation hospitals operated continuously under artillery observation and frequent direct fire. Nurses and doctors worked without the safety margins that normally protected medical facilities. The plasma supply chains held up despite logistics challenges that would have been insurmountable in earlier wars. Survival rates remained remarkably high considering the tactical situation. The 56th Evacuation Hospital specifically treated thousands of casualties during the Anzio campaign. The unit's records documented consistent survival rates above 90% for patients who reached the hospital alive, a remarkable achievement given the severity of wounds and the constant enemy fire that disrupted treatment. The 4 nurses who earned Silver Stars continued serving throughout the Italian campaign. Mary Roberts remained with the 56th Evacuation Hospital through the liberation of Rome and the advance into northern Italy. Elaine Rowe transferred to another medical unit after Anzio but stayed in the theatre. Rita Rourke served until the war's end in Europe. Ellen Ainsworth was killed 3 months later. On May 24, 1944, Lieutenant Ainsworth was aboard a hospital ship, the USAHS Street David, evacuating wounded from Anzio to Naples when German aircraft attacked the convoy. Despite being clearly marked with Red Cross symbols and proper lighting, the hospital ship was struck by bombs. Ainsworth was among 6 nurses killed in the attack. Her death underscored the reality that medical personnel at Anzio faced combat risks comparable to frontline infantry. The Red Cross provided no meaningful protection when enemy forces chose to ignore international law. The nurses who stayed with their patients during the February 10th shelling had understood this risk and accepted it as part of their duty. The plasma that kept those 42 soldiers alive during the artillery barrage traced its origins back to the research and protocols developed by Charles Drew and implemented through the underground network of medics and physicians who'd proved the technique's value in North Africa 2 years earlier. By 1944, plasma transfusion had become so thoroughly integrated into military medical practice that nurses were expected to maintain multiple plasma lines simultaneously under conditions that would have been unthinkable in any civilian hospital. The training that prepared nurses like Roberts, Rowe, Rourke, and Ainsworth for Anzio had been developed through hard lessons in earlier campaigns. North Africa had proved that plasma worked in forward positions. Sicily had demonstrated that nurses could manage high-volume casualties with limited resources. Salerno had shown that medical units could function under direct fire if personnel remained disciplined. Anzio combined all those challenges simultaneously and added the nightmare of sustained siege warfare. The nurses at the 56th Evacuation Hospital weren't improvising new techniques on February 10th. They were executing procedures they'd drilled dozens of times, applying training that assumed worst-case scenarios. The fact that they could maintain plasma transfusions for 42 patients during a 30-minute artillery barrage wasn't luck or heroism alone. It was competence forged through systematic preparation and reinforced by institutional knowledge accumulated across multiple campaigns. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The medical protocols that governed plasma use in 1944 were sophisticated compared to the improvised methods from 1942. Nurses received specific training in venipuncture techniques for establishing intravenous access under field conditions. They learned to calculate flow rates based on patient weight and injury severity. They understood the signs of transfusion reactions and how to respond. They could troubleshoot equipment failures and adapt to missing supplies. The plasma itself had evolved. By 1944, both liquid and dried plasma were available in the theatre. Dried plasma, developed through research programs that followed Charles Drew's initial work, could be reconstituted with sterile water and had essentially unlimited shelf life. Each unit came in standardized packaging with clear instructions. The bottles were designed to withstand rough handling during transport. The tubing and needles were increasingly standardized, reducing the improvisation that had characterized earlier campaigns. Supply chains had matured as well. The Red Cross blood donation programs that Drew had helped establish in 1940 and 41 were producing plasma at industrial scale by 1944. Tens of thousands of units moved through the logistics pipeline monthly. Evacuation hospitals like the 56th maintained stockpiles sufficient for mass casualty events. Battalion aid stations closer to the front carried plasma as standard equipment. Even individual medics now carried dried plasma in their personal kits. This infrastructure didn't exist by accident. It represented the accumulation of 3 years of learning, driven by casualty statistics that proved plasma's value, beyond any doubt. The soldiers who survived Anzio with plasma transfusions weren't benefiting from experimental medicine. They were receiving proven, standardized treatment that had been refined through thousands of previous cases. The 4 nurses working that preoperative holding area on February 10th had access to resources that medics in North Africa could only have dreamed about in 1942. They had adequate plasma supplies, they had proper equipment, they had institutional backing for aggressive plasma use. They had training that assumed plasma transfusion as the default treatment for hemorrhagic shock. What they didn't have was safety. The Red Cross markings that were supposed to protect medical facilities meant nothing to German artillery observers who viewed hospitals as legitimate targets. The nurses understood this reality every day they worked at Anzio. Every shift carried the possibility of dying while trying to save others. The decision to stay with patients during the shelling wasn't irrational heroism. It was a calculated risk assessment. Roberts had looked at 42 patients who would die or suffer severe complications if their plasma transfusions were interrupted. She'd looked at the incoming shells and estimated they had maybe a 50% chance of survival if they stayed. Running to the bunkers guaranteed the patients would die. 50% odds of saving everyone versus 100% certainty of losing patients. The mathematics favored staying, so they stayed. The official Silver Star citation captured none of this calculation. It described the nurses' actions as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, language that suggested spontaneous courage rather than deliberate professional judgment. But the nurses weren't being reckless. They were doing their jobs under conditions that made their jobs extraordinarily dangerous. This distinction matters because it reveals something important about battlefield medicine. that often gets lost in heroic narratives. Medical personnel face combat risks not because they seek danger, but because doing their jobs properly requires accepting risks that others would avoid. The nurses at Anzio didn't volunteer for artillery fire. They volunteered to treat wounded soldiers, and treating wounded soldiers at Anzio meant working under artillery fire. The Army's decision to award Silver Stars rather than reprimands for insubordination reflected institutional recognition that combat medicine sometimes requires violating standard procedures. The hypothetical order to evacuate to the bunkers represented reasonable concern for personnel safety. The nurses' refusal represented equally reasonable prioritization of patient care. Both decisions were defensible. The nurses' decision produced better outcomes. This pragmatic approach to discipline characterized much of World War II military medicine. When rule-breaking saved lives, institutions found ways to retroactively legitimize the violations. The underground plasma network in North Africa had been officially sanctioned after the fact. The nurses at Anzio received medals for ignoring orders. The pattern repeated throughout the war wherever medical personnel found that regulations conflicted with patient survival. The broader context of what those 4 nurses accomplished on February 10th becomes clearer when examining the complete medical picture at Anzio during the winter and spring of 1944. The beachhead represented a unique convergence of factors that tested military medical systems beyond any previous limits in the war. The geographic constraints were unprecedented. Most combat zones offered some depth, some areas where medical facilities could operate beyond effective artillery range. Anzio offered no such luxury. The entire beachhead measured roughly 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep at its maximum extent. German artillery positions in the Alban Hills could reach every square foot of that territory. The 88mm guns that had earned fearsome reputations as anti-tank weapons served equally well in indirect fire roles. German gunners could lob shells anywhere on the beachhead with reasonable accuracy. The heavier 170mm guns positioned farther back had ranges exceeding 20 miles, making even the beach itself, where supplies arrived, vulnerable to precision bombardment. Medical planners had assumed they could position evacuation hospitals near the beach, protected by distance from the front lines. That assumption collapsed within days of the initial landing. There was no safe rear area. Hospitals set up near the beach took fire from long-range artillery. Hospitals positioned inland faced more frequent shelling from shorter-range guns with better observation. The 56th Evacuation Hospital's experience was typical of medical units throughout the beachhead. Between their arrival on February 7th and the breakout in late May, the hospital compound was shelled on 43 separate occasions. German aircraft attacked the area 16 times, despite Red Cross markings visible from high altitude. Personnel casualties among medical staff exceeded those in most infantry companies during comparable periods. Yet the hospital continued functioning. Surgical teams operated through bombardments. Nurses maintained patient care during air raids. The medical evacuation chain never broke completely, despite constant disruption. This resilience wasn't accidental. It reflected systematic preparation and institutional depth built through earlier campaigns. The Army Nurse Corps had expanded dramatically since 1941. From fewer than 1,000 nurses on active duty when war began, the Corps grew to over 57,000 by 1944. These weren't untrained volunteers. Every nurse held professional credentials and completed military medical training before deployment overseas. The training programs had evolved rapidly as combat experience accumulated. Early war training focused on basic military discipline and field sanitation. By 1944, training included extensive instruction in trauma care, shock treatment, plasma administration, surgical assistance, and operation under combat conditions. Nurses rotated through base hospitals where they gained experience with combat casualties before assignment to forward units. Mary Roberts had completed nursing school in Arkansas before joining the Army Nurse Corps in 1942. Her training at a military hospital in the United States included 6 months working in surgical wards, treating casualties evacuated from North Africa and the Pacific. She'd seen severe trauma cases and learned plasma protocols from nurses who'd served in earlier campaigns. By the time she reached Anzio, she'd already supervised medical teams in Sicily and mainland Italy. Elaine Rowe's background was similar: nursing school in New York, Army Nurse Corps training, rotation through a stateside military hospital, then deployment to the Mediterranean theatre. She'd worked evacuation hospitals during the advance up the Italian peninsula from Salerno through the Winter Line battles. She understood combat medicine's specific demands before arriving at Anzio. Rita Rourke and Ellen Ainsworth followed comparable paths: professional nursing credentials, military training, or combat experience in earlier campaigns. None of the 4 nurses were novices on February 10th. They were experienced trauma nurses who'd managed mass casualties under difficult conditions multiple times before. This institutional depth mattered enormously. The Army Nurse Corps had created a system where experienced personnel could train newer nurses, passing along practical knowledge that formal instruction couldn't convey. Techniques for managing equipment failures, shortcuts for establishing intravenous access in difficult patients, methods for maintaining sterile procedures under field conditions. These lessons transferred informally through direct mentorship. The nurses at Anzio benefited from knowledge accumulated across dozens of hospitals and hundreds of individuals. The plasma administration techniques they used had been refined through thousands of previous transfusions. The triage protocols that determined which patients needed immediate plasma and which could wait came from statistical analysis of earlier casualties. Even the decision-making under fire reflected institutional wisdom about when to evacuate and when to stay. The contrast with World War I nursing was stark. In that earlier conflict, nurses had worked almost exclusively in base hospitals far behind the lines. Forward medical care was provided by male medics and doctors. The concept of nurses working under direct fire didn't exist in American military doctrine. Nurses faced the same dangers from air raids and long-range artillery that threatened rear areas, but they weren't expected to function in forward combat zones. World War II changed this calculus completely. The scale of casualties and the speed of mobile warfare required medical capabilities close to the front. Evacuation hospitals, by definition, operated near combat zones. The nurses staffing these facilities necessarily faced combat risks. The Army chose to accept this reality rather than restrict women to safer rear areas because the medical mission required experienced personnel forward. By 1944, roughly half of all nurses serving overseas were assigned to evacuation hospitals, field hospitals, or other forward medical units. They worked within artillery range routinely. The awards of Silver Stars to the 4 Anzio nurses represented recognition that women were functioning in combat roles, even if military policy officially restricted women from direct combat assignments. The contradiction was obvious but largely ignored. Nurses weren't supposed to be in combat, yet they regularly worked under fire. They weren't technically combatants, yet they faced casualty rates comparable to support troops in rear areas. The institutional response was pragmatic denial. As long as nurses weren't carrying weapons or conducting offensive operations, the fiction that they weren't in combat could be maintained. The plasma that sustained patients during the February 10th shelling represented the culmination of a supply chain that stretched back to collection centers across the United States. Blood donors in American cities had no idea their contributions would keep soldiers alive during German artillery barrages in Italy, but that direct connection existed. The process began at Red Cross blood donation centers, where volunteers gave whole blood. Technicians processed the donations using centrifuge equipment that separated plasma from cellular components. The plasma was tested for disease markers, packaged in bottles or dried and sealed in vacuum containers, then shipped overseas through military logistics channels. By 1944, this system was producing over 100,000 plasma units monthly. The Mediterranean theatre received steady shipments that maintained stockpiles at major supply depots. From those depots, plasma moved forward through the supply chain to evacuation hospitals, field hospitals, and battalion aid stations. The movement was tracked through paperwork that ensured units didn't run short. The 56th Evacuation Hospital maintained plasma supplies sufficient for approximately 200 patients. This stockpile was replenished weekly through regular supply deliveries. The hospital also maintained emergency reserves that could be tapped during mass casualty events. The system worked so reliably that plasma shortages essentially never occurred in the Italian theatre during 1944. This reliability represented a remarkable achievement. Anzio's supply situation was precarious throughout the siege. German artillery regularly hit supply dumps near the beach. Ships unloading supplies faced air attack and artillery fire. Ammunition shortages periodically limited Allied artillery responses. Food supplies ran low enough that troops on reduced rations for weeks, yet medical supplies, including plasma, remained adequate. The military logistics system prioritized medical resupply over almost everything except ammunition. Plasma shipments moved on the same vessels that carried artillery shells. If a supply ship reached the beach, medical supplies came off first, before food or general equipment. This prioritization reflected hard lessons from earlier campaigns where medical supply failures had produced preventable deaths. By 1944, logistics officers understood that maintaining medical capabilities was essential for sustaining combat operations. Soldiers fought more aggressively when they believed that medical care would be available if they were wounded. Conversely, inadequate medical support degraded morale and combat effectiveness. The nurses managing plasma transfusions at Anzio were the visible end of a supply chain involving thousands of people across 2 continents, blood donors in Des Moines and Baltimore, Red Cross technicians processing plasma in New York and Chicago, logistics personnel loading supplies onto ships, Navy crews running the gauntlet to Anzio, supply troops unloading vessels under fire and trucking supplies to forward units. Every link in that chain contributed to keeping the plasma flowing. When Rita Rourke grabbed a plasma bottle during the shelling, she was accessing a resource that represented an enormous investment of time, money, and human effort. The fact that she could grab that bottle without thinking about its availability, without worrying that supplies might be exhausted, reflected the maturity of military medical logistics by 1944. The surgical teams working inside the operating tents during the bombardment faced different challenges than the nurses in the pre-operative holding area. Surgery requires concentration and precise motor control. Maintaining those capabilities while shells land nearby requires psychological discipline that most people don't possess naturally. The surgeons at Anzio developed techniques for maintaining focus under fire. Some reported that they entered a dissociative state during bombardments, aware of the danger at some level but able to compartmentalize the fear enough to keep working. Others described almost mechanical execution of surgical procedures, letting muscle memory guide their hands while their conscious minds tracked the shell impacts. The anesthesia personnel faced particularly difficult challenges. Maintaining proper anesthetic depth during surgery requires constant attention to vital signs and patient responses. Too much anesthesia risks death. Too little means the patient wakes during surgery. The margin for error is small under ideal conditions. Under artillery fire, with concussion waves disrupting equipment and shell fragments threatening everyone in the tent, the anesthesia providers performed minor miracles simply by keeping patients stable. The February 10th bombardment included several shells that landed close enough to the surgical tents that fragments penetrated the canvas. In one operating room, a shell fragment struck an overhead support beam and sent splinters raining down on the surgical team. The surgeon continued the operation with wood fragments in his hair. The anesthesia provider checked the patient's airway, confirmed breathing was adequate, and continued managing the anesthetic. The operation was completed successfully. That level of professional discipline under life-threatening conditions wasn't unique to February 10th. Similar incidents occurred throughout the Anzio campaign. Medical personnel learned to function in an environment where any moment might bring sudden death. Coping mechanisms that allowed them to continue working despite constant fear. And they supported each other through informal networks of shared experience and mutual understanding. The post-operative recovery wards presented yet another set of challenges during bombardments. Patients who'd just undergone major surgery were extremely fragile. Moving them during the immediate post-operative period risked reopening wounds, disrupting internal repairs, or triggering shock. Yet leaving them in tents that offered no protection meant accepting that shell fragments might kill them before they could recover. The nurses working recovery wards adopted a protocol of sheltering patients in place during bombardments. They would position themselves between patients and the direction of incoming fire, using their own bodies as shields. Multiple nurses were wounded this way throughout the campaign. Some died protecting patients who were too weak to protect themselves. This behavior wasn't officially required or even encouraged. The army didn't order nurses to shield patients with their bodies. But the nurses did it anyway because it aligned with their understanding of their professional duty. They were responsible for patient care. Under combat conditions, patient care sometimes meant accepting risks that peacetime nursing would never contemplate. The casualty statistics from Anzio medical units reflected these risks. Of the approximately 127 nurses serving with evacuation hospitals and field hospitals at Anzio, 6 were killed and dozens were wounded during the campaign. Ellen Ainsworth's death aboard the hospital ship in May was the most dramatic, but other nurses died in artillery strikes, aircraft attacks, and vehicle accidents while moving between facilities. The army didn't publicize these casualties widely. News reports from Anzio focused on infantry combat and the struggle to break out from the beachhead. The medical story received less attention, despite being equally dramatic in its own way. The nurses who died at Anzio were mentioned in brief notices, their sacrifices acknowledged but not explored in depth. This relative invisibility reflected broader patterns in how military institutions presented women's service during World War II. The army wanted to recruit women for military service, but worried that emphasizing combat risks might discourage enlistment. The solution was selective publicity. Women in uniform were portrayed in recruiting materials and news stories, but usually in relatively safe contexts. The reality that nurses at places like Anzio faced combat conditions comparable to infantry support troops was downplayed. The 4 nurses who received Silver Stars for the February 10th incident became minor celebrities briefly. News stories highlighted their courage and the historic nature of the first Silver Stars awarded to women. But the coverage rarely explored the broader context of nursing under fire or the systematic way the army was placing women in combat zones. Mary Roberts gave a brief interview to a military journalist shortly after receiving her Silver Star. She downplayed her own role and emphasized that many nurses at Anzio were doing similar work daily. She noted that the real story wasn't 4 nurses staying with patients during one bombardment, but rather dozens of nurses maintaining medical operations throughout a 4-month siege. Her perspective was accurate, but didn't fit the narrative structure that news organizations preferred. Individual heroism makes better copy than institutional competence. 4 nurses defying death makes a compelling headline. 50 nurses maintaining routine professional standards under difficult conditions for months doesn't generate the same public interest. The military medical establishment understood Roberts's point, even if the press didn't. The Surgeon General's office commissioned a study of medical operations at Anzio that examined casualty rates, supply consumption, personnel performance, and lessons learned. The study's findings emphasized the importance of maintaining forward medical capabilities, even under direct fire. The data showed that mortality rates among seriously wounded patients at Anzio remained comparable to rates in other theaters, despite the siege conditions. Soldiers who reached medical treatment had excellent survival prospects. The key was getting them to treatment quickly, which required medical facilities close to the front lines, which in turn meant accepting that medical personnel would face combat risks. The study noted specifically that nursing care quality didn't decline during bombardments or other combat stress. Nurses maintained professional standards throughout the campaign. Patient outcomes didn't worsen during periods of heavy shelling. This consistency suggested that the training programs and personnel selection processes were producing nurses capable of functioning under extreme stress. The institutional lesson was that forward deployment of medical capabilities, including nurses, was not only feasible, but necessary for maintaining the survival rates that modern medicine made possible. The Army expanded this principle in subsequent operations. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 included evacuation hospitals landing on the beaches within days of the initial assault. Nurses worked in Normandy under conditions similar to Anzio, providing advanced trauma care within artillery range of the front lines. The Pacific Theatre adopted similar approaches. Hospital ships and floating hospitals supported island invasions, positioning surgical capabilities close enough to beaches that casualties could reach treatment within hours. Nurses staffed these facilities under conditions that included air attack, artillery fire, and occasional small arms fire when Japanese forces infiltrated Allied positions. By 1945, the concept of nurses working in forward combat zones was so thoroughly normalized that it no longer generated much discussion. The Army Nurse Corps had proved that women could function effectively under fire. The survival statistics demonstrated that forward medical deployment saved lives. The institutional debate shifted from whether to deploy nurses forward to how to protect them better while doing so. The 4 nurses from the February 10th incident continued their service through the remainder of the Italian campaign. After the breakout from Anzio in late May, Allied forces advanced rapidly toward Rome. The 56th Evacuation Hospital moved with the advance, setting up in successive locations as the front lines pushed north. Mary Roberts remained with the unit through the liberation of Rome on June 4th and the subsequent advance into northern Italy. She served until the German surrender in May 1945, accumulating over 2 years of continuous overseas duty. After the war, she returned to Arkansas and worked as a civilian nurse for several decades. She rarely spoke about her war experiences except with other nurses who'd served in combat zones. Elaine Rowe transferred to another evacuation hospital after Anzio and continued serving in Italy through the war's end. She returned to New York after discharge and worked in hospital administration. In later interviews, she emphasized that her experiences at Anzio had been shared by many nurses and that the Silver Star recognized collective achievements rather than individual heroism. Rita Rourke remained in the Army Nurse Corps after the war, eventually retiring as a major after 20 years of service. She worked in military hospitals in the United States and overseas, training younger nurses in trauma care techniques. She maintained that the most important lesson from Anzio was the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of external circumstances. Ellen Ainsworth's death, 3 months after the shelling that earned her Silver Star, meant she never saw the Anzio breakout or the liberation of Rome. She was 24 years old when she died aboard the hospital ship. Her body was returned to Pennsylvania for burial. The Army presented her Silver Star to her parents posthumously. Her sacrifice represented the price that some military nurses paid for serving in forward combat zones. The legacy of those 4 nurses and the thousands of other women who served in combat medical units during World War II extended far beyond their immediate wartime contributions. They established precedents that shaped military policy for decades. They demonstrated capabilities that institutional prejudices had previously denied, and they helped create the modern military medical system where women serve in virtually all roles, including forward combat positions. The integration of women into combat zones happened gradually after World War II, driven partly by the proven capabilities of nurses in that conflict. The Korean War saw military nurses working in mobile Army surgical hospital units close to the front lines. Vietnam brought nurse practitioners and flight nurses into even more direct contact with combat operations. The gradual erosion of restrictions on women in combat roles eventually led to full integration in the 21st century. This evolution traced directly back to the precedents set at Anzio and similar campaigns. When institutional debates arose about whether women could function under combat stress, advocates could point to World War II nursing records. The data showed not only that women could perform under fire, but that their performance often exceeded male counterparts in comparable positions. The Silver Stars awarded to Roberts, Rowe, Rourke, and Ainsworth represented institutional acknowledgement that valor wasn't gender-specific. The courage required to stay with patients during artillery bombardment was identical, regardless of whether the person exhibiting that courage was male or female. The military's recognition of this reality through formal awards created precedents that advocates for women's equality would cite for generations. The plasma transfusion techniques that kept those 42 patients alive during the shelling evolved further after World War II. The Korean War brought helicopter evacuation that reduced transport times dramatically. Vietnam introduced more sophisticated fluid replacement protocols and better understanding of shock physiology. Modern combat medicine uses whole blood transfusions in forward positions, coming full circle to techniques that predated Drew's plasma research, but with modern safety and compatibility testing. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged from what those 4 nurses executed at Anzio. Rapid volume replacement prevents shock death. Maintaining blood pressure during the critical window between injury and definitive surgical care dramatically improves survival. The specific fluids and techniques have evolved, but the core concept that Charles Drew proved and that countless medics and nurses applied throughout World War II still governs trauma care today. Every civilian trauma center, every emergency room, every ambulance service uses protocols descended directly from World War II combat medicine. The integration of plasma transfusion into standard emergency care represents one of warfare's few positive contributions to human society. Techniques developed to keep soldiers alive on battlefields now save civilians injured in car accidents, industrial incidents, and violent crime. The nurses who administered plasma at Anzio weren't thinking about this broader legacy. They were focused on keeping their patients alive through the next shell burst. But their competence under fire, their refusal to abandon patients despite mortal danger, and their systematic application of proven medical techniques contributed to knowledge that would eventually save millions of lives far from any battlefield. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.